Hi there, this is David Taylor from DNAsix, Business Communications Specialist and e-learning program creator. So this weekend I was on the Lembit OPIC program on BBC Radio Kent, and we were talking about a story which is in the Daily Telegraph, which is talking about the use of Twitter by leading BBC journalists. The uptake of the story was that the BBC was going to start reining in what those journalists could and could not do on Twitter. There was a lot of talk during the general election about the BBC potentially not being impartial, and particularly some journalists not being impartial. It made me think that this is part of a wider issue though. So if we think about leading journalists at the BBC, so Emily Maitlis and Hugh Edwards, Laura Kunsberg, and in fact actually if you think leading journalists for Channel 4 News or any other news outlet, they will have their own Twitter accounts and they will be at liberty to write whatever they would like to on those Twitter accounts without it having to be cleared by someone else within the organisation. Clearly, if you are Hugh Edwards and you're writing something on Twitter quickly, you can't send it to be cleared by someone else because it's not really going to work. That's really not how Twitter works. But it then begs the question, what is the freedom they've got? So the BBC will have very strict editorial guidelines about what journalists can and can't do, certainly on air, but I think the story was off air, what were they doing on Twitter which they weren't doing necessarily in the broadcast editions of it. So it's a difficult one. It's a very difficult one because these are leading people within the BBC News team. They are almost expected to have their own opinions and will often voice opinions instantly that they're getting news coming in. But of course, instant news, you don't have the benefit of hindsight because sometimes instant news may not necessarily be as valid as the news once you've had a chance to see how correct it is or not. But the wider question for me is, if you think about BBC executives, BBC senior journalists, it's similar to being like executives in an organisation. This is the same issue. So we're now entering a world where senior executives can and do very often use social media for their own brand, to publicise their own brand, if you like. So you've got chief executives or maybe members of a board, senior managers will all have their own Twitter accounts, and they will voice their own opinions. Clearly though, even the managing director might have opinions which are out of step with the rest of the organisation and the brand guidelines, etc. So it does make it quite difficult. Which all comes back to the fact that there needs to be a proper strategy around communications within any organisation, even if you're the BBC. Also, when you're thinking about social media guidelines, those social media guidelines need to be really quite comprehensive. It's not a case of you can't do this and you can't do that. It's exploring where the boundaries lie. You don't want people not to be brand ambassadors. So clearly all those BBC journalists are fantastic BBC brand ambassadors, and you don't want to shut them all down and say, right, I don't want any of you to be on Twitter ever, because then they're losing out on a potentially vast amount of goodwill around the BBC brand. So the social media guidelines that you've got have really got to be very, very well thought through, but they've got to be part of an overall strategy. There's got to be a lot of dialogue with people within the organisation, and there's got to be a general level of understanding about what people can do, what people can't do, where are the grey areas, how can those grey areas be resolved. Again, it all comes back down to strategy and the culture of the organisation and how those are managed. Only time will tell to see what the BBC do with the senior journalists. But, you know, probably a good thing would be to follow some of them on Twitter to see what they're doing. I will hopefully pick this up in a future video. That's all for now. See you next time.